Last night we had primary elections in a number of states. A number of consequential elections. One I would like to focus on is Stacey Abrams winning the Democratic primary in Georgia, thereby making history, which we're going to talk about. It's interesting to think about where we go from these primaries to the actual elections in November. What is going to happen? Because obviously we also have Republicans in that particular state running on some pretty horrendous stuff. Joining me now to break down that race and others, we have Alexi Mccammond, political reporter and deputy news editor for Axios. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on. So starting first with Stacey Abrams' win in that Democratic primary, what should we take away from this race? Both the endorsements going into it, the actual campaign, and now what will happen in advance of November?
You know, everyone was looking to this race ahead of last night's primary election, and it's clear that we're going to be following this through November. Obviously, the big takeaway is that she's one step closer to becoming the first Black woman governor in the Deep South and in any state. There has never been a Black governor. There's never been a woman governor. There's never been a Black woman governor in Georgia. A Democrat hasn't won a gubernatorial race, a U.S. Senate race, or a presidential election in Georgia since 2000. So just becoming the major party nominee for this race is making history in and of itself. And I think the other thing we can look for moving forward is this idea of how she ran as, sort of unapologetically progressive candidate in the Deep South in a time when the Democratic Party is sort of encouraging these Democrats who are running in red states and red districts to pander to moderates and to the white working class voters. She has set up a new playbook for Democrats to use across the country, but especially in places where they think they can't win.
So I'm glad that you started on that, because I do want to talk about some of the different axes of differentiation between how the DCCC wants the candidates to run and how we have this new crop of progressive candidates. The strategy that you just laid out, Stacey Abrams apparently is very conscious of it, because this morning on CNN she said about Georgia, "I think we are a blue state. We're just a little confused," and said we're not going to win trying to put together the old guard coalition. Which I think is interesting. Now, in this case, she had endorsements from a number of national progressive organizations, from many of the likely presidential contenders in 2020. So now she is the candidate. We don't yet know for sure if it's going to be Casey Cagle or Bill Kemp on the Republican side, I believe. But what do you think her chances are going into November?
You know, there are a few crucial factors for us to consider if we're thinking about her chances going into November. You just mentioned the two potential Republican nominees who will obviously face a runoff in July. The interesting thing about them is this theory that they are running sort of so far to the right that they could alienate some more moderate or centrist Republican voters who wouldn't want to support them because of how conservative and to the right they're running. Now, that doesn't mean they would vote for a Democrat, especially the first Black woman to be their governor, but that doesn't mean that these Republicans will automatically get votes from Republicans. The other thing is that we saw a clear enthusiasm gap for Stacey Abrams. There was something like 150,000 more Democrats who turned out to vote last night for this gubernatorial primary on the Democratic side than we saw in last year and in 2020. It's the highest number of Democrats who turned out this year since 2010, not 2020. And I think that speaks a lot to not only this sort of campaign she ran, where she was saying to left-leaning voters, to progressive voters, to Black voters, right, to all these voters who might feel sort of out of place or ignored in Georgia, she was saying to them, I see you, I hear you, I am running as a candidate to support you, and I'm not going to abandon you because conventional wisdom will tell me to do that otherwise. And I think that's something that voters in the state will really appreciate moving forward. You mentioned some of her endorsements. The interesting thing about her is that we're in this moment where we are hyper-focused on the sort of ideological war happening within the Democratic Party, right? The sort of Bernie versus Hillary wings of the Democratic Party. Stacey Abrams was endorsed and supported by both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, which I think is something not to ignore. She's also supported by Emily's List, which is committed to investing tens of millions of dollars in the 2018 elections moving forward through November. They supported her over Stacey Evans, who, was a slightly more moderate candidate than Stacey Abrams. And I think that's something that's really significant for Abrams moving forward, is that she will have the backing of all these folks through November, which I think could ultimately help her chances in the state, in addition to the platform that she's running.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of cases where both Bernie and Hillary, Emily's List and Our Revolution have supported the same candidate. I'm glad that you brought up the enthusiasm gap, the huge amount of additional Democratic voters. I believe that Republican turnout was fairly stagnant. It was what was generally expected from past elections. So one of the things that I feel obligated in the media every week, we have to reassess, is there going to be a wave? If so, what is it going to look like? So broadening out from the Stacey Abrams race, considering some of the other races last night, what do you think we should take away from last night's general elections if we're trying to evaluate whether there is likely to be a wave, and if so, will it be a progressive wave come November?
I think that's a great question. And I think one thing we can take away when we're looking at the other states that had primaries, which were again all in the deep South, were that this is really a moment for women, especially on the Democratic side, but also political newcomers. If you look at Texas, for example, there were some, it might not be turning blue, but there's certainly some color that has been added to the Democratic side of candidates running this November in Texas. There's a former NFL player who is also a black man. There is an openly lesbian woman who is a Filipino American who would be the first lesbian Filipino American woman to hold a House seat in Texas, and that's Gina Ortiz Jones. There were a number of other folks who had never run for office before who are running a more progressive campaign that have made it now to running in the general in November. I will say one thing, though, that the Club for Growth, which is a very conservative group that sort of funnels their preferred candidates to the House Freedom Caucus here in Washington, they had a series of wins last night in Texas that I think shows what the Republicans are trying to do moving forward that could sort of block this blue wave that progressives are hoping will come for these more conservative states. They invested a ton of money in 5 candidates in Texas congressional primaries. 4 of them are moving forward to the general, and we can expect to see them electing and pushing and investing in more traditional hardline conservative candidates to move forward to show what Republicans hope will become the Washington representation of these deep red states moving forward.
Yeah, and man, when I think about the hard right candidates, I definitely am curious what's going to end up happening in Georgia, because following the dueling anti-immigration ads from those candidates on the Republican side, that was a little bit scary if you're worried about the future of democracy in America.
Right, and I think that's one thing we should look for as well, is like there's a number of polling and folks who focus on advertisements that say that negative ads don't always work, and Republicans love to put out negative ads. That doesn't mean Democrats don't put out negative ads.
Yeah.
We all know that they do. But the 2 ads that you just mentioned were a pretty significant example of how negative Republicans are willing to go. And that doesn't always move the needle for voters, especially on issues that they know the voters are already fired up about, like immigration.